My wife, Pat, she made a statement when she was real sick at the end of last year, and she was home. You could put me right in a nursing home where they'll do all this. I said, honey, do death do we part. I meant every word of it. And she started crying.
There's a man in Ocala, Florida, who is 94 years old, who has been set on fire, who has had half his foot torn off by an exploding transmission, and who still walks into a museum full of the machines that hurt him and tells visitors the story with a straight face and a steady voice. His name is Don Garlits, and drag racing fans call him Big Daddy. But the part of his life that gets repeated the most, the crashes and the records and the championships, is not actually the hardest part of his story. The hardest part happened quietly in a small house over the course of several years, and it had nothing to do with an engine at all. To understand why his life reads like both a triumph and a tragedy at once, you have to go back to a dairy farm outside Tampa, to a kid who was not supposed to become anything close to a legend. Donald Glenn Garlits was born on January 14, 1932, in Tampa, Florida. This was not a household with money or connections to motorsport. It was a working farm family, the kind of upbringing that teaches a person to fix things because there is no one else around to fix them for you. As a teenager, Garlits and his brother pulled apart and rebuilt an old Model T, and that early tinkering planted something in him that never really left. He wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing the feeling of making something faster than it was built to be. By the early 1950s, drag racing barely existed as an organized sport. It was closer to an outlaw hobby. Cars lined up on public roads and dry lake beds. Young men testing homemade machines against each other for nothing but bragging rights. Garlits built his first true dragster himself in his own garage and named it Swamp Rat Eye, a nod to the Florida backroads he grew up on. It wasn't polished. It wasn't backed by a sponsor. It was just a farm kid's idea of how fast a car could go, built with his own hands. It worked. By the late 1950s, Garlits was setting records that the sport's early organizers could not ignore. He was quick, he was stubborn, and he had a habit of building his own solutions instead of waiting for someone else to invent them. That habit would define the rest of his life, for better and for devastatingly worse. In 1953, before any of the records and before any of the fame, he married a young woman named Patricia Beeger. Neither of them could have known that this marriage, more than any single race he would win, would end up being the thing that decided whether Don Garlits survived his own career. Nitromethane fuel is what let dragsters accelerate the way they did, and in the earliest days of the sport, nobody fully understood how unforgiving it could be. In 1959, at a race in Chester, South Carolina, Garlits' car erupted into flames without warning. The fire wrapped around him before he had any chance to escape it, burning through his face, his arms, and his legs. He was rushed to a nearby hospital in agony, and the doctors who examined him delivered the kind of news that ends careers on the spot. They told him his hands were so badly damaged that amputation was the only option. For a man who built and drove his own cars with those hands, that verdict was almost a second injury layered on top of the first. A racer with no hands isn't a racer. He isn't even a mechanic. It would have been the quiet, medical end of Don Garlits, only 3 decades into his life. His wife, Pat, refused to accept it. She would not let the doctors amputate, and instead she found another physician at a different hospital in Florida who believed the hands could be saved. While Garlits lay in agony, she got him onto a train and traveled south with him to give him that second opinion a chance. It worked. His hands were saved. And within months he was back in a car, no more cautious than before, only more convinced that the sport itself needed to change rather than the men driving it. It would not be the last time Pat Garlits made the difference between her husband racing again and her husband not existing at all. If the fire in 1959 was the first warning, March 8, 1970, was the day the sport actually collected on its debt. Garlits was racing at Lions Drag Strip in Long Beach, California, behind the wheel of Swamp Rat 13, a front-engine dragster of the classic slingshot style, where the driver sits just behind the front axle and directly ahead of the transmission and engine. That afternoon he was running an experimental 2-speed transmission of his own design, built partly from automatic transmission parts borrowed from a Chrysler, something he had nicknamed the Garlits Drive. He barely got off the starting line before it failed. A component inside the transmission spun wildly out of control before the whole unit came apart with enough force to tear through the front of the car. In a front-engine dragster, that explosion happens right at the driver's feet. The blast split the chassis in two just ahead of the cockpit and tore away part of Garlits' right foot. Debris flew into the crowd and injured spectators, including, by some accounts, a young boy in the stands who survived the incident. Garlits was pulled from the wreckage alive, and surgeons later amputated what remained of the damaged portion of his foot. He would race for the rest of his career on a foot that had been rebuilt from what the accident left behind. Most people who survive an injury like that walk away from the thing that caused it. Garlits did the opposite. Lying in a hospital bed, he decided the problem wasn't racing. It was the architecture of the cars. If the engine and transmission sat behind the driver instead of in front of him, an explosion like the one that had just taken part of his foot would blow away from the cockpit instead of directly into it. The concept of a rear-engine dragster wasn't brand new. Other builders had tried it before and failed to make it competitive. But Garlits suspected the earlier attempts had failed because of bad execution, not because the idea itself was wrong. While recovering at a hospital in Long Beach, Garlits spent hours working through the geometry of a car that didn't exist yet, sketching layouts for a dragster with the driver up front and the engine and drivetrain behind him. Once he was well enough to return home to his shop in Seffner, Florida, he kept working from a wheelchair, cutting parts himself on a bandsaw. Two collaborators, T.C. Lemons and Connie Swingle, helped turn those sketches into an actual machine. The result was Swamp Rat 14. Skeptics in the sport openly mocked it. Some drivers reportedly didn't want to line up next to it, convinced the layout would be too unstable or too slow to matter. Garlits took it to the 1971 Winter Nationals in Pomona, California, for its competitive debut, and won the event outright against a field of traditional front-engine dragsters. Within roughly 2 years, the rear-engine layout had become the standard across top fuel racing, adopted by nearly every builder in the sport. The design that came directly out of the worst injury of his career ended up protecting the hands, feet, and lives of hundreds of drivers who came after him, most of whom he would never meet. It is a genuinely rare thing in any profession, a man's worst day becoming the safety standard for everyone who follows him. Garlits would go on to become the first driver to break 200, then 250, then 270 miles per hour in the quarter mile, racking up multiple national championships along the way, and eventually opening the Don Garlits Museum of Drag Racing in Ocala, Florida, in 1984, a place where he still gave tours himself well into his 90s. But behind every one of those records and every one of those recoveries was a woman whose name rarely made it into the headlines. Patricia Garlits married Don in February of 1953 when he was 21 years old and his racing career barely existed as an idea. They stayed married for nearly 61 years. For most of that time, she was on the road with him from one track to the next, through fires, through explosions, through the years when the sport had almost no safety regulation at all and injuries were simply an accepted cost of doing business. She never asked him to quit. Her role went far beyond simply being present. It was Pat who fought to keep his hands from being amputated in 1959. It was Pat who found the doctor who saved them. Every championship, every record, every rear-engine dragster Garlits ever designed was, in a very direct sense, built with hands that only still existed because his wife refused to let go of him. Within the sport, she earned the informal title of the First Lady of Drag Racing, a recognition that she had shaped the story every bit as much as the man behind the wheel, even if the cameras rarely pointed at her. For decades, that partnership looked unbreakable. And then slowly, it began to end in a way that no amount of engineering or determination could fix. In her later years, Pat developed a long and difficult illness involving both Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's, conditions that took her memory and her mobility gradually, over roughly a decade and a half, with the final years described by those close to the family as especially hard. Garlits did not place her in a care facility. He kept her at home in Ocala and cared for her himself as her condition worsened. The same intensity he had once poured into building record-setting engines now redirected into a single room in his own house. There was no part to redesign here. No transmission to move, no cockpit to reinforce. The woman who had remembered every race, every burn, every mile of highway they had driven together was slowly losing pieces of that shared history, and there was nothing he could build his way out of. He has said publicly that around 6 months before she died, she told him that if anything happened to her, he should not spend the rest of his life alone, that he had too much life left in him to spend it in solitude. It's the kind of thing a person says only when they understand, with complete clarity, exactly what's coming. Pat Garlits died at their home in Ocala on February 2, 2014, at 5:53 in the afternoon. She was 79 years old. Garlits was with her, holding her, along with their 2 daughters. In a message he sent to friends afterward, he wrote that she had been suffering in her final days, and that it had been a mercy for her suffering to end. And he mentioned that he had been playing her favorite big band music in the background as she passed. He was 82 years old, and after nearly 61 years of marriage, he had outlived the one person who had been beside him for essentially his entire adult life. By his own account, the aftermath nearly broke him in a way that fire and shattered bone never had. He has described withdrawing into himself in the months that followed, losing his appetite, losing weight, and losing interest in the shop and the cars that had defined his identity for over half a century. His daughters tried to coax him back out into the world. For a while, it didn't work. What eventually pulled him back was the same instinct that had carried him through every disaster before it, the refusal to sit still. Garlits has said plainly that stopping is, in his mind, close to dying, and so even in his 80s and 90s, he kept building. At 82, he set a speed record in Swamp Rat 37, a battery-powered electric dragster generating roughly 2,000 horsepower. At 87, he did it again, pushing an all-electric car to nearly 189 miles per hour, applying the same restless engineering mind that had reinvented the combustion-powered dragster decades earlier to an entirely new kind of racing. He kept the museum in Ocala open, walking visitors past the very machines that had scarred him, telling the stories in a voice that hadn't lost its edge. People who've spoken with him in recent years describe someone sharper in conversation than people decades younger, still opinionated, still sketching new ideas on the backs of napkins and old shop invoices. He never remarried. Pat's absence became something he learned to carry rather than something he tried to replace. One of his cars, Swamp Rat XXX, the streamlined dragster that carried him past 270 miles per hour and to a championship, now sits in the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., a recognition that what he built mattered to the country, not just to a niche motorsport. The car that took part of his foot sits in his own museum in Ocala. Between those 2 machines is essentially the whole shape of his life, one monument to what he survived, and one monument to what he achieved because of it. If you only know Don Garlits from the racing footage, you know a man who cheated death repeatedly and came out faster every time. Burned nearly beyond recognition in 1959 and racing again within months. Half his foot destroyed in 1970, and out of that wreckage came the design that reshaped an entire sport. Those are the stories that get told at award ceremonies and in highlight reels, because they have a clean shape. Disaster, recovery, innovation, triumph. What rarely gets told with the same weight is that the single hardest thing Garlits ever endured wasn't a fireball or an exploding transmission. It was sitting beside the woman who had pulled him back from death more than once, watching her slip away by inches over years, with no fix available, no redesign possible, nothing to do but stay and hold her hand and wait. He had outrun explosions at over 270 miles an hour. He could not outrun that. At 94, Don Garlits is not a broken man fading quietly in a corner of a museum. He is still sharp. He still shows up. He still tells the stories himself, in his own gravel voice, about the fire, about the transmission, about the wife who refused to let doctors take his hands, so that those hands could later save countless other drivers he'd never meet. But every one of those stories carries a second, quieter story underneath it, about the 61 years he spent beside Pat, and about the empty house he has lived in since February of 2014. Maybe that's the most accurate way to describe his life, not as a triumph that overcame tragedy, and not as a tragedy hiding behind a triumph, but as both things existing in the same man, at the same time, for the same reasons. Every catastrophe, he survived fed directly into an innovation that protected someone else. And the one loss that offered no innovation, no redesign, no comeback, is the one he still carries every single day, quietly, in a house in Ocala that he has said became very quiet the moment she was gone. He is still here. He is still building. And he is still, in every way that matters, the man Pat Garlits refused to let the world take from her, even now that the world has taken her from him.